if I were trying to summarize the entire ministry of Jesus in a single phrase, I would say that he came to give sight to the blind. And so when you see the miracles of Jesus that involve giving physical sight to people who are physically blind, there are much, much deeper levels going on, because in some senses, the miracle itself is only one level of what's actually happening. It's people's reaction to his ministry, his presence, and his teaching. So all the ways from those who want to debunk what he's saying, across to people who wake up and move into a totally different state of consciousness, where they're listening to Jesus and seeing his teaching at a mystical level and not just at a literal level. So I've chosen a piece of chapter 9 from John's Gospel. It's a piece of a much longer story of Jesus restoring sight to a blind man. And here's how it goes. As Jesus went along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" "Neither this man nor his parents sinned," said Jesus, "but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. As long as it is day, we must do the works of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world." After saying this, he spat on the ground, made some mud with the saliva, and put it on the man's eyes. "Go," he told him, "wash in the pool of Siloam." So the man went and washed and came home seeing. His neighbors and those who had formerly seen him begging asked, "Isn't this the man who used to sit and beg?" Some claimed that he was. Others said, "No, he only looks like him." But he himself insisted, "I am the man." "How then were your eyes opened?" they asked. He replied, "The man they call Jesus made some mud and put it on my eyes. He told me to go to Siloam and wash. So I went and washed, and then I could see." These are words inspired by God. So my theme for the month of August has been illness and healing. And so on August the 11th, I focused on the illness portion of that. And then last Sunday, August the 18th, I focused on the healing portion of that. So today, I'm going to do a recap of those two homilies and then open it up to a Q&A. So the whole first section was why illness? And I gave several different kinds of explanations or models or kind of theories of illness. So I started with biblical explanations. So the Old Testament explanation for illness, whether it was a physical illness, an emotional illness, a mental, a social, or a spiritual illness, the Old Testament explanation for all illness was that it was due to spirit possession. So the main source of all illness is a demon-guided, spiritless world. So when you hear about then the casting out of demons, particularly in the ministry of Jesus, do you take this literally? Do you take it symbolically? Or do you take it esoterically? Or what combination of them? So it's fascinating to me what's been happening in the Roman Catholic Church over the last about 25, 30 years. There's a whole new emphasis on exorcism. And it's been done really scientifically at this stage. So before a Catholic exorcist is taken in to kind of address a situation, the person must firstly undergo a psychiatric evaluation, and then a physical examination to find out, are there any kind of physiological reasons for what they're claiming is happening to them? And then, and only then, will a Catholic exorcist, perform an exorcism. Now, I'm a big believer, actually, that, the main source of all illness in our world right now, actually sociologically, is a demon-guided, spiritless world. And I'll get back to that a little bit later. And so in some senses, it is really true that the illnesses of our time, the sociological and the global illnesses of our time, are due to kind of some kind of demonic possession of the human global psyche. So I would say then that we should never underestimate the ability of ritual to create altered states of consciousness, which have many effects on the body, on the psyche, and on society itself. So whether that ritual is an exorcism, or it's voodoo, or it's sacraments, or it's the white coat of the doctor. Ritual is really, really important in altering a state of consciousness, and that results often on effects on the physical body, on the psyche, on the soul, and sociologically, on the planet itself. So briefly, that's what I said about biblical explanations for illness. I looked at the Hindu explanations, and I just made two little points. The first one is the notion of Maya. Maya, or illusion, is basically, it is the misidentification of the self with the ego. It is the reduction of the soul to the ego, the skin-encapsulated ego. And so it is the misidentification of sensory input with their mystical origins. It's like mistaking a signpost for the destination. You want to go to Palo Alto, and you're going down 101, and you see a signpost that says Palo Alto 7 miles, and you think you've arrived. So very, very often, the ego is kind of the misidentification for the soul. So that's a huge source of illness in the Hindu model. The second piece would be karma and its reincarnational resolution. So we get all of a lifetime to try to do good and kind of rectify the mistakes we've made. And then incarnationally, we get an opportunity to look at our performance and to come back in again, to give it a second shot and a third shot, until finally we get it at the core of our being that the only thing that exists is God, and the only thing that's real is love. So that would be my hit on the Hindu model. Buddhism has its hit on it. The Buddha said one time famously, pain is inevitable. Suffering is optional. And I think this is an extraordinarily good insight, because pain is the price of incarnation, and it is inescapable. We live in a planet which is subject to all kinds of vicissitude, volcanoes, tornadoes, lightning storms, all these kinds of things. So we can't avoid pain, but we can avoid suffering. Because suffering, I'll talk about this in much more detail later, it definitely is optional. The second thing the Buddha said was that all pain, all suffering rather, is the result of, he called it dukkha, which is either attachment or aversion. So all our suffering is that we're attached to something, even addicted to something, whether it's a substance or a relationship, or aversion, to people or to ideas. So all suffering comes from these two, attachment or aversions. That was his great insight. St. Augustine flourished around 400 of the Common Era, and he was a North African, Roman citizen that converted to Christianity, after living as like a rake. He actually had an illegitimate child out of wedlock, but he got converted to Catholicism around the year 400. Now at this stage, Augustine is convinced that reason and rationality is the apex of human development. It is the way in which we most resemble God. And he looks at the difference between the Roman Empire and how it was constituted, on rational principles, vis-a-vis the Vandals and the Huns of Germany and Gaul, who were totally irrational beings. And he claimed that we most resemble God when we're most rational, and we least resemble God when we're most irrational. And so he said, when a couple is making love and they have an orgasm, it's at that moment they're most irrational, they're most unlike God, and at that stage that the little baby is conceived. And that was his notion of original sin, that we're conceived at the moment in which our parents are most ungodlike because of the irrational behavior of an orgasm. And the result, he claimed then, was threefold. Our will is weakened, our intellect is darkened, and the body is subjected to sickness and to death. So that was Augustine's great insight. And unfortunately, the Christian church has followed suit and adopted that as well. I talked a little bit about homeopathic explanations for illness. A brilliant German physician called Samuel Hahnemann was born in 1755. He observed that fetal development is what he called cephalocaudal and proximodistal. So the fetus and the embryo developing side, it develops cephalocaudally, which means from the head downwards, and proximodistal from the interior outside. And he claimed that all healing happens in the same direction. That if you're attempting a healing of anybody, you have to induce some kind of an intervention that allows it to go cephalocaudally from the head down and proximodistally from the inside out. Now, he claimed that illness goes in exactly the opposite direction. illnesses, he believed, all begin with a physical condition. And if we medicate the symptomology, we'll drive it into the emotional arena. And if we keep, medicating the emotional symptoms, we'll drive it finally into the mental/spiritual arena. He believed that symptoms, rather than just being the indicators of an underlying disorder and therefore had to be repressed, that symptoms were actually evidence of the body healing itself. This is the body creating a symptomology which was the conduit for the healing to occur. And so homeopathy then is the attempt to accelerate that process, whereas allopathic medicine is to drive the symptoms deeper and deeper and deeper, from the physical to the emotional and finally to the mental, spiritual. And I use the kind of example of, imagine you had a kind of an early warning system around your home. And so at the garden gate, you have some kind of a device that rings in your bedroom if somebody climbs your fence. And then you got a second one on the front door and a third one on your bedroom door. And now you're inside in bed and the one on the fence goes off. And instead of getting up and investigating, you turn off the signal. So you can't hear the signal from the fence anymore. And then sometime later, the one on the front door goes off. And rather than investigate it, you turn that one off. And now the one in the bedroom rings and now you're attacked. So that's literally what you do when you repress the symptomology, according to homeopathic understanding. I talked then about Big Pharma's explanation for illness. And according to Big Pharma, all illness is caused by biochemical imbalances. And therefore, the only effective cure is drugs and medications of various kinds. And they always necessitate more drugs to overcome the side effects of the first wave of drugs, and then even more kind of drugs for the second wave of side effects of these drugs. So that's Big Pharma's explanation. Throw more medication and more drugs at the process. I spent a lot of time and a lot of years trying to figure out models of illness and explanations of illness for myself. And I came up with a few different kind of models. So the first thing was based on a kind of a visionary experience I had some years back, where I wanted to know the difference between sin and evil. And so as I was going to sleep at night, I seeded my dream and said, give me an insight into the difference between sin and evil. And I woke up about 4 o'clock in the morning with this phrase burned into my mind. And it said, sin is the individual transgression of a culturally created precept. Now, that sin is merely kind of breaking a human-made law. Evil, on the other hand, is a cosmic conspiracy using human intermediaries to separate souls from source. So it's of a totally different order, with literally cosmic origins using human intermediaries to separate souls from source. And we certainly see plenty of evidence of that in our world right now. I believe then that a culture itself can be possessed, not just an individual person, but that a culture can be possessed. And then here's what you're going to see. The fruits of a possessed culture will be the following. You'll see the breakup of family. You'll see the orchestrated breakup of friendships. You'll see the orchestrated breakup of all the important relationships in your life. That's the first wave. Then you'll see the intentional corruption and sexualization of young children. Then you're going to see racism and wokeism. And then finally, you're going to see the abrogation of basic human and constitutional freedoms, like freedom to worship, to travel, freedom of thought, of speech, and of writing. And this, in my opinion, I would call this a psychosocial virus, much, much more deadly than COVID itself. I looked at the Buddhist notion of the tulpa. The tulpa is kind of the personification of unacknowledged shadow material in each one of us, because every thought we have, every word we speak, every action we engage in has an energy. And when that energy isn't recognized and dealt with, light isn't shone on it, it becomes what Buddhism would call a tulpa. And it can take on physical, psychological, or even social forms. And then we feed it by the reactions we make as societies to this. So we're living under the cloud of a huge tulpa in our world right now. And then that's aided and abetted by the notion of projection. So if tulpas are the unacknowledged shadows, and we then project that onto other people, then we have individual conflict, we've got group conflict, and finally we have a global conflict. It's like the great Pacific garbage patch in the Pacific Ocean. Rubbish which has been dumped from the west coast of North America and the east coast of Asia and ships at sea. And because of the gyroscopic nature of the tides in that area, there's a patch of garbage which is bigger than the state of Texas right now. That's the projected, rubbish, of 2 continents. And we're doing that at a psychological level, and we're doing it at a sociological level. Another source of illness I would claim is the movement from service to self to service to other. Every single one of us, as a little infant, is a narcissist. We need to be narcissistic in order to survive infancy. So we're greedy little creatures. So we need mama, we need milk, we need a breast, we need comforting, we need a soothing voice. So we're totally self-engrossed. But we're meant to outgrow that and eventually go across the 51% line where we're in service to others until finally we, like the Mother Teresa's of the world, is in service particularly to those who are hurting or marginalized. But typically the narcissistic infant, if it's not educated properly, if it's not in a society which encourages it, it becomes greedy, then it becomes avaricious, then it becomes angry, then it becomes violent, and finally you have warfare among the adults. So that's the movement from service to self to service to others. I will also talk about the notion of what I call harvesting, the importance of differentiating between the thing in itself and the opportunity to harvest it. I would say that there's not a single event that happens in your life, and there's not a single relationship of which you are a part from which you cannot harvest the grain of evolution or the grain of enlightenment. It is not what happens to us that's important. It's how we harvest and deal with what happens to us. And so I created a model, I called it the 6 factors of illness. And very often I would use this with my clients. A client would come with a particular illness of various kinds. And I would ask them, take this 6 factor model and see what percentage, is causing your particular illness. So the first factor is genetic predisposition. So there are certain kind of cultures who are much more likely to develop particular kinds of illnesses than other cultures. There are some families within the culture who maybe go more prone to heart attacks or strokes or whatever. And then there are the individuals within the family who have their own individual genetics. So the first level of illness is to look at the genetic blueprint. The second one is, I would say, environmental influence. And by environment, I mean everything from the in utero experience of the developing embryo to the family you grew up in, the neighborhood you lived in, and the culture of which you were a part. So your environment has a huge effect on the illnesses that you're going to experience throughout life. The third factor I would call personal lifestyle. Your diet, your exercise regimen. Are you a couch potato? Are you running marathons? So your personal lifestyle is huge. The fourth is your personal belief systems. Are you a happy or a hopeless person? Are you a victim? Are you empowered? Are you atheist or are you spiritual? Because these have a huge effect, on the illnesses you're going to experience. Number 5, I believe, is karma. I mean, good and bad karma, cause and consequence. Because there are some lessons which are so important that often a soul will dedicate several incarnations to experiencing and working through particular issues, including illnesses of various kinds. And it's not that they're being punished, for stuff they did in previous incarnations. It's a mission to say, if I were to experience such and such an illness in a lifetime, how would I handle it? Would it move me towards enlightenment or towards, a criticism? And the sixth one I would call the bodhisattva vow. The bodhisattva is the being who has worked off all their own personal karma, but they keep coming back to wake up the rest of us because they have compassion for all suffering beings. So sometimes I say to people, go, whatever the presenting symptom is, go back home, and assign a number to each of these 6 factors. They have to make up 100% finally. What percentage of this do you think is genetic? What percentage is environmental influence? What percentage is personal lifestyle? What percentage is your belief system? What percentage is karma? And what percentage is the bodhisattva vow? Make out this formula for yourself. Now, the truth is, if the origins are number 1 or 2, if it's genetics or environment, science will figure that out eventually. If it's number 3 or 4, personal lifestyle or personal belief system, it is totally within your power to clean all of that up. Totally within your power. And if it's number 5 or number 6, if it's karma that you've signed up for or the bodhisattva vow you've taken, then that's your soul's mission. No matter what you do, you will not overcome the illness. This is part of your mission right now. So it becomes very important then to distinguish between the etiology of an illness and the purpose of an illness. The etiology is just how you got to be sick. The purpose is why you chose to be sick. So that's a 6-stage model I created. Later, I went on to create another 6-stage model, and here's what it looks like. I believe that, with the Buddha, that pain is inevitable, but that suffering is optional. So the pain is the price of incarnation, but the suffering is a result of the stories and the interpretations and the explanations we tell ourselves about our pain. So suffering is always the result of stories, interpretations, and explanations that we foist upon the real pain that we're experiencing. Factor number 2 then for me would be what's sometimes called acts of God, natural disasters, earthquakes, tornadoes, hurricanes, volcanoes. And so when we experience those, we have suffering of various kinds. So that's a second factor. Now, the fundamental Christians would believe that actually an act of God also means that God is directly punishing you for the sins you've committed. I don't believe that, but fundamentalist belief systems often come up with that model. Or those who believed in a multiplicity of divinities, they believed that a lot of our human suffering is the result of collateral damage as the gods in heaven duked it out with each other up there. We would call it the collateral damage. Factor number 3, I believe, would be if you believe in the Gaia hypothesis, that Gaia is an extraordinary soul. It's a planetary soul. And then Gaia is always attempting to achieve homeostasis. And so in some senses, when we see these apparent acts of God, whether volcanoes or tornadoes or whatever, I would call it a kind of an anthropomorphic form of nature karma. Nature is not just getting back at us, but nature is trying to re-regulate itself, from human influences. And so in some senses, Gaia herself may be a factor in the illnesses. Number 4, I believe, is the very makeup of our bodily spacesuits. And this is the part that Augustine got correct. Our will is weakened, our intellect is darkened, and our bodies are subject to illness and death. So we're living in these spacesuits. We made an agreement that at some stage we'll shuffle off these mortal coils, but in the interim, we're going to experience aging and illness and finally death. And so suffering comes when we don't accept that as a reality and as the mission for which we signed up. The 5th factor, I believe, would be conflicts of various kinds, interpersonal conflicts, intercommunal conflicts, and even international conflicts, violence and war and theft and lies. So we have managed to develop a whole lot of what I would call self-suffering causing agents in our arsenal of responses to life on planet Earth. So that would be a huge factor for me. And then finally, and perhaps most devastatingly of all, comes, as Hinduism says, with the identification of the ego, with this concomitant separation from God, from others, and from nature. So these were all the reasons I gave for the illness part of the equation. I went on then last week to talk about healing, like how healing. And the first thing I said was that life is an improv theater. There's no plot and there is no script when we come down. All we know when we volunteer for incarnation is the following. We know the past histories, the strengths and the weaknesses of all the players, including our own, as we parachute into incarnation. We know exactly what each player is capable of by way of their past history, their strengths and their weaknesses. We also know the current state of world, regional, and family dynamics that we're parachuting into. We're not blindsided when we come down. We know precisely the world and the family and the region that we're coming into. The third thing we know is the mission. What have you signed up to come to do in the planet? And then finally, your secret, sacred name, and which is the song that your soul constantly sings to you during incarnation. But you have to be awake in order to hear it. You'll be buoyed up all the time during the vicissitude of life if you know what your secret, sacred name is, if you're listening to the song that your soul is singing you. I talked about then the elements of effective prayer. And again, I had a 6-stage model for this. Stage 1 is that before you can effectively engage in prayer, you must do some house cleaning. It is counterproductive to offer water from a contaminated faucet to a thirsty traveler. Somebody is thirsty, you offer them water, but the faucet is contaminated, you're poisoning them. So before you begin to pray, it becomes very, very important that I purge my mind of all gunk, anger, fear, anxiety, and especially unforgiveness. And so Jesus would famously say, if you're going to offer your gift at the altar, and then you remember that you have something against your brother or your sister, leave your gift, don't offer it, go back home and be reconciled with your brother or sister, and then come back to the temple and offer your gift. So we must clean out the system before we even engage in effective prayer. Stage 2 then is, I now have to fill my heart up with compassion, the realization that all beings are manifestations of the same source, that we're all sunbeams from the same star. That will be stage 2. Stage 3 then is to send out laser beams of love at the target. And this can't just be formulaic. It must have the archer's focus on the target. It must be that kind of laserized. Stage 4 then is to take whatever disciplined action is required in the situation. A la the victim, pray as if everything depended upon God, live as if everything depended upon yourself. So you must take the requisite steps to heal. Stage 5 then is a trust in some superpower, whether you call it God or combined intention or love. You have to trust that there's some superpower that can translate your intention into an actual outcome. And then stage 6 is detachment. And this may sound counterintuitive, but it's not. Because once we have done our part, then we have to surrender to a much higher intelligence, an intelligence that designed an entire cosmos. And we have to surrender to this power to figure out the optimal route and the perfect timing for the intended outcome. It's not ours to say when or how the healing needs to occur. I talked then about the notion of this beautiful Catholic notion of the communion of saints, even though the languaging is terrible. So Roman Catholicism divides up people into 3 groups. And so they call the church triumphant, which is those who made it to heaven. And then there's the church suffering, which is the people in purgatory. And then there's the church militant, which is us here on planet Earth. Now, I disagree with the language, but the reality is really beautiful, that all souls are continually interconnected, no matter what stage of the evolutionary project that they're on. And so whether it's the church militant, us here, whether it's the church suffering in purgatory or the church triumphant at the other side, that notion is important, because part of the church triumphant is actually your own soul self guiding you from above. When they talk about the church triumphant, the church in heaven, I'm talking about something very different. I'm talking about that level of your soul which never left the side of God. So that's guiding you from above. So that's the church triumphant for every single one of us. Now, I actually believe that this is true, that every person, every family, every community, every nation, in fact, every species has a soul self, a suffering self, and a militant self. There are all these parts to every grouping of us, and they're all attempting to cooperate with each other. I talked about then about what about you're trying to heal yourself? How do you go about trying to heal yourself? Now, again, once more, I'm addicted to the number 6. So here's healing in 6 stages. The first stage of healing, of self-healing, is meditation. I have to figure out, the difference between the causes of my illness and the purpose of my illness. And so I look at the 6 previous causes I mentioned: genetics, environment, personal lifestyle, personal belief systems, karma, and bodhisattva, and figure out through my meditation, what are the causes of my illness, to differentiate between the etiology and the purpose of it. So that's the focus of the meditation, to figure out here, what is the purpose of this particular illness before I attempt to heal myself. When I've done that, stage 2 is then to pray for the healing with a laserized, focused intentionality on my own welfare. Stage 3 then is, there's this Arab kind of a saying that says, pray to Allah, but first tie up your camel. If you're a desert Bedouin, and you're wandering through the desert and you camp for the night, you don't tie up your camel. The camel's going to wander off looking for water. So don't ask Allah to look after your camel if you don't do what you need to do. So in other words, do the simple, obvious things. Look at your diet, your exercise regimen, your sleep patterns, your exercise, your relationships, and then visit healers of various kinds, whether they're people with, white coats, or whether they're kind of herbalists or whatever they are. That's stage 3. Stage 4 then is to go back again to meditation to try to fine tune it. You meditated, you prayed, you did what you needed to do. There's been an outcome. Now meditate again to try to fine tune, steps 2 and 3. And then work with the outcome. Stage 5, you have to work with whatever outcome it is, even if it's a temporary outcome. And the final piece is you cannot lose, because even death can be the ideal healing outcome. So to realize that when you've done everything you can do, that even if the illness results in death, this was the ideal outcome. This is what you pre-agreed upon before you incarnated. Now, what happens then when you want to live in a way that's healing for other people? So the first thing is the service to self, the service to others. To move across the scale, to be compassionate to others rather than focused on the self. And so, as I say then, the doctor's white coat or the instruments are part of a ritual whose primary effect is basically a placebo. That the very visit to a man or a woman with a white coat and a stethoscope, is going to kind of create confidence in you that there's a possible, healing abounding. The third one is wise women and herbology. Throughout human history, particularly among the women, using herbs of various kinds, there have been tremendous healers. A case in point was the very famous Hildegard von Bingen from Germany. I would claim that our planet has all of the remedies needed for all of the illnesses of all of the species that inhabit Gaia. That Gaia is this extraordinary, benevolent mother who has created all of the remedies necessary for all of the illnesses that her children are likely to experience. So Gaia, for me, is a self-healing system for all of our children, all the way from insects to human beings. I want to say a word then about witches, the way in which these healers, these women healers, were vilified and burned at the stake throughout Christian history. But it's still happening. The modern witch hunt is against natural modalities of healing and is still it's subject to this kind of rooting out. Except that now the persecuting church that used to be Christianity is now Big Pharma, the WHO, the FDA, and the CDC. And the modern book-burning equivalent is censorship and a cancellation culture. Now, in response to that, then, there are 4 types of compassion: confirmation, cooperation, compensation, and confrontation. Confirmation is encouraging people. You're that boy, you're doing a great job, keep it up. Cooperation is the realization that we're all part of a team. Not everybody can be the quarterback on a team. So everybody needs to play their function. Number 3 is compensation. Somebody makes a mistake and you pick up the ball so there's not an interception. And then number 4 is confrontation. Sometimes you need to call people out, on what they're doing, or what they're saying, or what they're promoting. And then there are 5 different levels to compassion. There's the mirror neuron. There's a part of the human brain that's activated when you see somebody suffering. Literally, there's a neurological reaction. It's called mirror neurons. Secondly, there's the psychological reaction to others' pain, the emotional you feel when you see somebody suffer. And then thirdly, there's the sociological intervention, the practical help you're going to offer somebody who's in distress. And then the 4th level is spiritual. That is the prayer. You're reaching out energetically for these people. And then finally, the mystical level of compassion is the realization that this is God's gig. That when you've done everything you can, and the people who are suffering have done everything they can, it's God's gig. Finally, God will determine the outcome and the kind of trajectory. Now, as distinct from living for others in order to heal them, how do you actually pray for others to heal them? So what happens when we initiate a conversation with God? So there's a difference for me between meditation and prayer. Meditation is when we are listening to God. It is the transcendence of God in dialogue with his immanence. So meditation is initiated by God. It's a conversation initiated by God where we are the listeners. And prayer is a conversation which is initiated by us, in which God's immanence is in conversation with her transcendence. So a difference between prayer and meditation for me. And as I mentioned last week, from my own doctoral dissertation in 1992, I conducted what was then the largest double-blind controlled randomized experiment of the effects of prayer at a distance on human beings, particularly on their psychological well-being, self-esteem, anxiety, and depression. I was measuring these three. And altogether, 507 people took part, 90 of them as agents who were doing the praying, and they prayed every day for 15 minutes for 12 weeks, and then 417 subjects who were divided up into three groups, two experimental groups and one control group. And they were the targets of the prayer. And then after analyzing, statistically, the simple answer to, does prayer work? The answer is, you betcha, it works very powerfully. And the biggest surprise for me was that the agents, the people who were doing the praying for others, benefited even more spectacularly than their targets on the improvement of their own self-esteem, anxiety, and depression levels. And so in conclusion, before we open it up to Q&A, I would say this to you. You volunteered, every single one of you volunteered to be here and to be here now. You're not here by mistake. You didn't take a wrong turn somewhere. You volunteered to be here, and you volunteered to be here now. So embrace your mission. Whatever it was that sent you, embrace it.
There's this cultural malaise or spiritual illness whereby no matter how giving we are, it's still better to be rich than poor. And that might be both a sin on the personal level and evil at a mass cultural level. And we segregate our living by economic status and try to avoid having our children come in contact with those who are poor. And I wondered if you could address that in the context of the phrase in the Gospels that the poor will always be with us.
Right. That's a great question, Tom. And so for me, then, it becomes really important, what is the mega perspective I'm going to take on life on planet Earth? Because as I say, we're stuck in most of us are going to live, 80, something like that. That's the human trajectory. Whereas the history of Homo sapiens sapiens at this stage is about 70,000 years old. And history of life on planet Earth is 3.7 billion years of age, and the cosmos itself is 13.6 billion years of age. So we take this tiny little slice of stuff and we attempt to construct a graph. If I were to put a graph on a blackboard and cover up most of it and just show you a small section in the middle and ask you, Tom, where do you think this graph began and where is it headed? On the basis of what you can see, you're going to extrapolate. Now, if this was a stepwise graph, that's ascending, and I just show you a plateau, you're going to think that the graph began as a straight line, a horizontal straight line, and will continue. So unless you can see a much bigger section of the graph, you can neither tell the origin of the graph or the final destination of the graph. So the thing that allows us to do it differently, I believe, is a reincarnational model, is to realize that, we've been here many, many times before, and we'll be here many, many times again. And so all we're getting right now is this tiny little slice, where in fact there's this huge discrepancy between those who have and those who have not. But this is part of an evolutionary trajectory in which we're going to literally grow into love, into the realization that we're all bite-sized pieces of God. But we're obviously not at that place yet. But the souls keep coming back in order to move the stuck wheels of human evolution into a place where it'll be as obvious as the nose on my face that we are all equal. That skin color or gender or ethnicity, have no bearing, on who the soul is. And therefore we let go of all of these kind of life rafts we're hanging on to desperately in the turmoil of incarnation. So it becomes really, really difficult for people who don't have a deep spirituality, I believe, or who don't have a belief in reincarnation, to be able to accept the present situation and not give up or not become part of the problem by just grabbing as much as we can, as quickly as we can. So the perspective becomes all important. And the perspective can only be held by some deep form of spiritual exercise, whether it's time spent in nature, whether it's meditation, whether it's watching little children at play, whether it's developing a cosmology, a reincarnational cosmology, whether it's listening to the teachings of the great avatars like the Jesus figures, and the realization they're offering us a vision of reality in which there is only God and there is only love. Last September, when I was really, really sick, I had a series of visions. I've shared these before. And the visions were the following. Firstly, I saw that there was only God. That's the only reality. And then the second stage was that God self-fractured into these holographic, fractals of source called souls. That was stage 2. Stage 3 was there was a kind of a conference between God and these souls. They said, let's do something creative. What can we do? And the decision was, let's create a cosmos. Wouldn't it be fun to create a cosmos? And we created this extraordinary cosmos of trillions of solar systems and galaxies. And we were delighted with the outcome. And then at some stage, souls began to say, I wonder what it would be like to actually be a participant in the cosmos rather than an observer of the cosmos. What if we were to kind of adopt avatars, spacesuits, and kind of parachute into it and become a member of that which we previously just observed? And now we become what cultural anthropology would call participant observers. And we come into that, and there are various levels of densification of that cosmos. And in order to fully grok and experience what it would be like to appear to be separated from source, we go right down to three-dimensional reality. And Christ will go one step further. There's this great creedal formulation that in the 3 days that Jesus spent in the grave, he descended into hell. In other words, he visited the most remote, the densest, and the darkest level of separation from God in order to bring light into that. Now, you and I and everybody here are at some level of that descent. We're in there someplace. But our job is to remember where we've come from. And the realization that we chose to be participant observers, not merely witnesses from a distance. And Buddhism will differentiate then between what they call turiya and turiyatita. Turiya is the witnessing consciousness that realizes that I can't identify with the spacesuit. But turiyatita is the willingness to participate in the spacesuit without forgetting, that I'm not the spacesuit. This is a role I'm playing. Now, in that process, we have to accept that we are now currently in a state of world evolution, hopefully evolution, in which we're still seeing that categorization of important people versus the unwashed masses. So it means courage on our part. It means going back again and again and again to the realization that ultimately there is only God and that there is only love, that we co-created this cosmos, that we then created avatars in order to become participants in this cosmos, to kind of move the density and the darkness back into the light. So for me, it's a question of the patience and the insight to realize that we can only overcome these temporary obstacles by remembering who we really are and seeing that even in the assholes at the other side who are perpetrating this kind of indignity on others. To be able to see while we still confront. It's important to confront when it's necessary, with the realization that we're at a stage of human history in which we're moving the ball forward a little bit, and to not to be addicted to it has to happen in my timeline in the way I want it in order for it to be real. And it's a huge, big ask for every single one of us. So finally, you said, why did Christ say the poor will always be with you? Because Christ realized that in the process of incarnation, there will always be this struggle between light and darkness. And there need to be people on both sides of the equation in order to kind of energize the light bringers to take part in this cosmic battle.
So on the healing yourself, I got my recent experience with the 2 surgeries on the hips. I got to play with that a little bit.
Sure.
And one of the things that I did is I first of all, I won a trip through work to Bermuda, but I could barely walk at that time. And my +1 was my sister, who acted as a human cane. For my birthday, she had me do, I had a massage. The one thing I really got was I hadn't been really grateful to my hips. Okay. I had not really acknowledged how far they'd carried me in life and the job that my body had done for me. And here I was at the point where I could barely walk, and I just broke down and cried, and I thanked my hips so much for being there for me. So I think an important piece of healing yourself is to be grateful for what your body has carried you through so far, and to look back and be really humbled by the fact that you've been in this space suit that's done such a great job for you.
This is precisely, mentioning two very important pieces. The first is when Jesus met this blind man and they asked him whose fault was it, that he was born blind, his parents or himself. Now that's actually a reincarnational teaching. You can't be born blind for your own sin if there wasn't reincarnation. But Christ said he wasn't born blind for anybody's sin, but that the grace of God could be seen in him, so we could appreciate what it's like to be sighted. And so you're having the same experience. You're having the experience of what is it like to be very, very, very mobile. And you had to be denied mobility in order to appreciate that fully. So that's exactly what Christ was saying in today's gospel. And the second part of it, the gratitude prayer, there's a beautiful exercise I came across recently. I don't know who created it. It's praying in gratitude for something that hasn't happened yet, which is, again, you're saying, and to pray with the gratitude, totally convinced, that you're being blessed. So it's not, you're not bargaining with God. If I pray this, will you give me that? It's the realization, that you're grateful for whatever outcome is going to transpire here now. So gratitude is hugely important. I would say it's, when I think about the difference between hope and gratitude, hope is a kind of a fear-tinged expectation for the future. Gratitude is a love-filled celebration of the moment. Great point, Chris. Thanks a million.
When you spoke about the soul parts, you said the militant, the suffering, and the triumphant, I think.
Yes,
yes. And you said what the goal is that they work all together.
Yes, yes.
Could you give an example of something simple of what those three components in harmony would look like in the behavior of a human being?
It's beautiful, Pat. So, as I say, I disagree with the language that the Catholic Church is using, which is the idea of a militant group and a triumphant group and a suffering group, but the notion that all souls are interconnected, that becomes really important. And so what I mean by this then is, no matter if we find ourselves in the flesh right now, we're incarnated, you and I are incarnated right now, but there's a part of Lorian that never left the side of God. Hinduism will call that Atman, and it'll call the part that's incarnated as Lorian, they'll call it Jiva. So the soul only devotes a tiny portion of its energy to any incarnation. Most of it is at source. So there's a part of you already in the sight of God, but you've agreed to amnesia. You're for the purpose of incarnation, you've agreed to not be totally aware constantly of that realization, but there is that part of you there, as there is of every single one of us, as there is of every culture. There's a kind of a spirit level of culture. There's an incarnational level of culture. And so then there's the suffering level of a culture. There are the disenfranchised in various ways, people who are physically ill or incarcerated for whatever reason. And so in some senses, there very definitely is a suffering element to humanity. Now that goes through every single one of us as well. There's a part of you which is triumphant in the sense that you've overcome so many obstacles in your life. And that part of you is resident with God. That's part of who Lorian is. There's a part of you where you're militant in the sense that you're dealing with current vicissitude and struggle, and you're working your way through that. And there's a part of that suffering that has been somehow oppressed in some way in your past by circumstances, and so that's part of your history. So you hold those three pieces together within you. And if you as an incarnated being can hold that realization together, that there is indeed a suffering part of you, that there's a militant part of you that's taking the requisite steps to deal with the vicissitude, and there's the triumphant part of you that's the eternal being that cannot suffer at all. And these three pieces are working in concert, and you can bring those together constantly through meditation, time spent in nature, watching little children play, reading good literature, following the examples of the other great avatars, the Buddha figure or the Mother Teresa figures. So we got lots of examples showing us how to pull these three pieces together. But every single one of us has those three pieces available to us. It's only a question of reaching out and making contact, making conscious contact.
So then also would illness be the fact that you're trying to reject one of those pieces? Is it the wholeness is holding all of it at the same time?
It is, and it's not a question of rejecting any part, it's a question of harvesting every part. And so as I say, there's a huge difference between the situation in which you find yourself and your ability to harvest it. So we reject nothing, but we harvest everything. Yeah. You can, when during the Irish famine time, when there was no food, potatoes were gone, they ate nettles. They harvested nettles, literally harvested nettles. So the thing is, can you harvest any situation rather than reject any situation and find some good in it, some spiritual nutrition in it?
My question is about herbology and the popularity of psychedelic healing.
Yes.
And
Yes.
going back to August when you talked about altered states and
Yes.
allowing evil in, and what your thoughts are on how those work together.
Brilliant. A great question. And so obviously there's a long history on planet Earth of using, consciousness altering, compounds. In fact, there's one theory that there are three great groups in the Old Testament prophets, three levels of prophecy or three stages of prophecy. And the first was called the Guild of the Prophets. That the first group of them, they operate as a group, they weren't individuals. Then the second was individual non-writing prophets like Elijah, they never wrote anything down. And then the third group was the great writing prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah. But the first group, operating as a group, there's a lot of evidence that they were using some kind of psychedelic mushrooms and that they were operating as a group. And we certainly know that in the Eleusinian mysteries in ancient Greece, that they were using some kinds of psychedelic substances. There's evidence, in fact, that, there's some theory that the initial Eucharistic meals involved some kind of potentized wine that also induced an altered state of consciousness. So there's been a long history of tribal peoples throughout the world who are using various combinations of plants in order to alter states of consciousness. Now, I've never done LSD, but I'm fascinated by the research that went into it. I've never done mushrooms, but I'm fascinated by the research that went into that. And what I'm seeing again and again that done properly, people like Stan Grof, who was a great Hungarian researcher, he's still alive, a great psychiatrist. I talked about his work on the basic perinatal matrices a few weeks ago, who was using LSD when it first came out to treat psychiatric patients. Then it was outlawed. So he developed different techniques. So obviously, everything that nature creates, has a purpose. Like I said, there is no illness on planet Earth for which Earth has not provided some kind of medication, and mostly they're herbal remedies. And so obviously, there's been this extraordinary trajectory of herbology throughout human history, mostly used in sacred ritual. So again, in these kinds of encounters, they talk about the 4 S's: the substance, the mindset, the sitter, and the setting. That's very important. So if you're doing kind of a rave encounter with loud rock music and stuff like that and expecting to have an encounter with the divine, it ain't going to happen. But if you're working with a shaman or a trained healer of various kinds, using particular kinds of plant medicines, then you're very likely to undergo a series of altered states of consciousness. And some of the research in this is showing extraordinary benefits with obviously, when you shift your state of consciousness, you're privy to different levels of reality. I've said many times that there's a big difference between imagination and fantasy. That fantasy is the ability to make up stuff that's not real. Imagination is the ability to volitionally alter my state of consciousness, visit other realms of consciousness, interact with beings, and teachings there, learn from them, and then bring it back here. And that's what anything that alters your state of consciousness is an imaginative exercise in the sense in which I'm saying it is. So the greatest gift a real scientist has, or a poet has, or a kind of musician has, or a teacher has, is imagination. Now, the imagination can be jump-started then using various kinds of rituals. For me personally, Eucharist is a kind of a plant medicine. When I'm celebrating Eucharist, I'm in a different state of consciousness by virtue of the liturgy I'm celebrating. And that's been true for 52 years as a priest. That's been my plant medicine, the bread and the wine, because of the mindset. So the liturgy and the kind of state of consciousness can be achieved using many different formats. And I'm a big believer that human beings should have total control over the ways in which they access these states of consciousness, as long as they're not being, antisocial or a danger to anybody else. So that's my short response to your question, Ted.
My question is about witnessing suffering in another. With those of us that we witness each other's pain, how do we help the other, and how do we help ourselves with our own pain of tragic stories?
Okay, great questions, Elizabeth. And so let me just revisit a few things I'd mentioned in that long homily. The first one is the realization that there are 5 levels of compassion, as I mentioned. So in watching somebody else suffer, the first one is the kind of the neurological reaction, the mirror neurons in you being activated, by watching this friend of yours suffer. So that's the first level. And so even that already, is a kind of that's a connection. So at that level, what you can do actually is there's a beautiful Buddhist practice called Tonglen. Tonglen is the practice of drinking and with the in-breath, drinking in the pain of the world, transmuting it in your own heart and breathing out healing. So you can literally do that for an individual target or for a global target. So making a practice of transmuting the pain into love with each breath. So that's what I say about the mirror neurons. The second one is the kind of the mental or the emotional reaction to it. Your heart is tugged by watching somebody else suffer. Now, if your heart is tugged, it means there's an opportunity to enlarge it. A tugged heart gets bigger. So now you're becoming a more loving being, which means that you can put out more loving energy to the target and to the world. The third part then, is that you're making a sociological intervention in some way. You're talking to this friend of yours, or you're offering some kind of a physical help of some way. So kind of practical ways, you're reaching out. And that's exercising your compassion as well. The fourth level then is praying for this person and praying for the system of which he's a part, his family system and the world system. And that's literally putting out the energy of love. And here again, I have the 80-20 rule for myself. 80% of the time, I want to focus on the good, the loving, and the beautiful. And 20% of the time, I want to focus on confronting the evil. And so it's to make sure that even as you kind of, as you're praying, that you're putting much more energy into the love of the prayer rather than the upset, with the situation. And then finally, the mystical level, which is the realization that this is God's gig, in the sense that it will change in the way and in the time which is ideal in God's plan. Because as I say, we came in here with a preconception contract. We chose the people with whom we were going to be in contact, knowing everything about their previous histories, abilities, and strengths, including our own, knowing the world situation in which we were coming, the likely kind of evolution of what was going to happen in the world after we were born. And we still said, yes, send me. And so we're in the ideal situation that we actually pre-planned and chose. And so the thing is then, how well can I harvest what I'm seeing around me, and through Tonglen, transmute the pain of the world into love for the world.